great. Thank you. Thanks, Toby. Yeah, as Toby said, I'm Associate Professor Susan Engel. Let me just start by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the land of the Wadi Wadi people of Dharawal Nation on Aboriginal land whose sovereignty was never ceded, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the devastating impact of colonisation on the campuses of the University of Wollongong, and commit to healing and truth-telling as part of this process. I've been teaching a Model UN for a number of years, but I'm also quite interested in policy and policy writing. I started my career in the public service, and I've worked for NGOs, and as part of my academic work, I do write often, sometimes with NGOs, with some of the development NGOs like Jubilee Australia and Oxfam, or as an academic, policy submissions and policy papers. And I review policy papers for an organisation called Jubilee Australia, which is a social justice research NGO. So I think this is a really important space. So I'll jump into it. I did have some slides because, you know, I'm an academic and we just have to do that sort of thing.
Slides are the
Pretend
best.
we're
Slides are the best.
pretend we're serious. It might take me just a second to get this set up because I have that multiple screen thing like you were just saying. Share screen. Um, Now, I think it's going to make me want to share that screen. Just at the moment, can you see my, oh, hold on. Sorry, I have this most annoying thing with 3 screens
Hmm.
and the mouse doesn't sometimes work where I want it to
Oh,
work. So I think you've got that screen and now I just have to get my mouse back. There we go. Can you see my slides
yes.
there?
Coming
Excellent.
really clear. It's great.
Brilliant. So I did a few slides. Help me structure it. But look, it's quite a formal topic, and there's things about a lot about structure in writing policy papers, position papers. So there we go. So basically, I'm going to start with a little bit on country research, and then look at position papers, and I've got a little bit on policy papers as well, which I think is just a general useful thing for students, particularly as you're coming forward to look for jobs, to understand some of this work, because particularly if you're doing public service job applications, writing a policy briefing or a short briefing paper will often be one of the tasks you'll do in your interview process. So having a good structure is the first way to start to approach that task and understanding what the task is about. So I've got one little slide on that as well. I like an interactive process. Since there's only a few of us on here, if you've got a question or something to add in, please just jump in, unmute yourself. But I will ask at various times for questions, or also for you to share your expertise as well. So this is all about the Model UN, and this is the sort of the early part of this, where often fitting in, depending where if you're writing position papers before you start your debate, which is a really good way to prepare. So you're researching your topic and your country, and then you go on to debating the topic, negotiating, and writing and amending resolutions. The policy papers normally fits in right at the start. And the first thing is always to start with your country research. And I can't emphasize this really enough. Understanding your country well, understanding the kind of essence of it, the zeitgeist, what makes people excited and motivated, but also some of the things that really shape the possibilities and the limitations of the country is really vital. I quite like this YouTube channel called Geography Now. It's probably more designed for high school students, but oh, look, they give you a brilliant overview of the key. They do, geography, history, politics. They look at things like ethnicity, race, gender, um, class, and not so much if they do class, but class and caste are things we can't forget about either.
Mm.
So it's kind of a nice way to start, and they're pretty inspiring as well. It just helps you to get inspired about the country you're looking at. So start with, if you fancy it, start with Geography Now, um, and then learn about your country. You need to understand about the the geography of the country and how that impacts the country. Its history. Was it a colonial possession? Who were its colonial powers?
Mm.
Um, what are the major uh, ethnic makeups? Are there major tribes? Is it multi-ethnic? Is there, ongoing historical divisions based on race and ethnicity and religion and caste and class and other factors like that? What's the economy doing now? It's so vital to understand possibilities. So, what are the major industries? If you want to know uh, a bit about the major industries, one way I love is to look at the Observatory of Economic Complexity that's on
Mm.
the slide there. They do these brilliant data visualizations on exports and imports of countries. So you can see what the major exports and imports. So if you look at Australia, it's coal briquettes and iron ore and other brown stuff. Brown is, brown and a little bit of other primary. And they do it by colour, and brown is the country colour they use for mining and related industries. So our export profile is brown. A bit of green for agriculture, a bit of, I think there's a bit of blue there but might be aluminium or something, but Australia has the export profile of a developing country, and we import cars and technology and stuff like that. So understanding that the makeup of economies, but the export and import don't tell you everything either.
What? No
Um,
microwave. Sorry.
that's all right. Um, Understanding the bit about the size of the economy, the levels of poverty, longevity, all that sort of stuff, really useful to help you understand about the country. So, the World Bank's, oh, there's apostrophe missing in World Bank's data bank is a good source of data. The UNDP's Human Development Index, the Observatory of Economic Complexity. If you're looking at the UN itself, their UN stats is good. Or if the country has a lot of countries have their own statistical agencies, things like the World Bank and the UNDP often just rely on those. If there's an English language version of the country's statistical agency, you might be able to look at that, although some of them are pretty hard to navigate. So sometimes it's better using secondary providers. Um, on the UN, member states on the record is good for looking at your country's voting record on particular
Mm.
topics. The UN Global Issues site is really good, but you can also go to all the specific agencies, which is more about then when you're getting into doing your topic resources. Uh, with your countries, I also up the top there, I jumped over that CIA World Factbook or BBC country profiles aggregate a lot of that basic data and history and politics, and they're useful. Just as an academic, I don't love to see them referenced, but look, for basic data, they're fine. They're pretty reliable.
If I could ask, if it's
Yep.
possible, when you talk about academic sources, are there specific journals you would highly recommend that are like very good for international opinions and data?
Yeah. It's totally going to depend what topic you're working on, Toby. It's like there's peacekeeping journals that are specifically devoted. So if you're doing a peacekeeping topic, so if like for your broad country research, there's regional speciality journals. So there's Southeast Asian Studies, and there's South Asian journals. There'll be Latin American journals. So they'll help you get the latest on your countries. So the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, or is it South and East Asian Studies, has one issue every year where they look at the political developments in each major country in the region, and there'll be other journals do that as well. So they'll just give you a quick political update of key things shaping the landscape in that country. So there might be journals that'll help your country research, but when it comes to they're probably more useful for your topic research. And once you know what specific topic you're doing, there's probably a journal on it.
Yeah. Oh, another question before we move away from research. Are you
Yep.
familiar with the YouTube channel TLDR?
Oh, no.
They do very informative short form, like little informative videos that specifically talk about current world issues that are happening at the moment. Like, for instance, I think their most recent video was talking about the Myanmar rebels and the chance that they
Yeah,
might
right.
they're doing quite well in that conflict. And they do
Mm.
really nice short summaries of topics and conflicts that I thought I would just interject and put that there. Because I know a lot of
I'm going to
international
check
students.
that out.
Oh, they're very good. Their sources are very well cited. They have
Yep.
they're very official, clean cut, and
Yep.
they really give good backgrounds to topics that you otherwise would really struggle to find.
Oh, that sounds brilliant. I'm going to check that out. Thank you. Don't forget local sources as well. So checking out the official foreign policy of the country you're working on is always very useful. A lot of countries will have an English language newspaper. And there'll often be the Foreign Affairs Department will often have an English language. Almost everyone now has an English language version, the hegemony of the English language of their website. So don't forget those. Check out some of the movies or literature of the country you're studying. If you've got time and passion, it does help you understand the zeitgeist. Any other suggestions there from anybody on the call about good places on your country? The TLDR is again probably more for your issue rather than your country, although it could be a bit of both too.
Hmm. Well, there's another YouTube channel. I know a lot of other people. This is also very issue specific, but like channels like Real Life Law will take a specific issue, like the Houthi rebels, occupation of the boats, I think in the Red Sea,
Yep.
and they'll do a long history of why that's occurred, what's the
Nice.
interventions around it. These all have their slants, obviously, like they're
Yeah.
freelance content, and they don't try to rock the boat as much, but they still I give you at least a basic understanding of the main players in a conflict.
Yep.
I think Real Life Law is a pretty solid one for the most part.
Excellent. Another one I'm going to check out. There's so many good things around, and because this is all extracurricular, making it through a format like video is really, I think, useful to keep up your motivation rather than having to sit and there's always some reading required, but I think multiple different. I'm a big listener. There's lots of great international relations podcasts and podcasts about countries as well. And if I open my podcast app, I could list you off some of my favorite on Australia.
Oh,
Australia in the World is pretty good, bit conservative, but pretty good. Um, Anybody got their favorite podcasts? I'm listening to Van Jackson's Undiplomatic podcast at the moment. That's pretty cool. What else have I got here? I'll just open my app for you.
I know this one isn't as strictly an international relations podcast, but I think it's the ABC's stuff that the British stole.
Stuff
Um,
the British stole.
is
Yeah, that's
really
pretty
it's
good.
not like, specific to a country, but yeah, I find it really fun. At least mapping the history
Yeah,
and the reach that the UK actually had over the world.
yeah. There's the New Books Network do a bunch of academic books. If there's a book on your country and you don't have time to read the whole thing, you can have a look if the New Books Network has done a podcast on the book as a shortcut way as well. So Yeah, there's lots more, but there's a couple of good ones. Um, and some of this really cuts into this issue analysis, because a lot of the sources we've been talking about are as much. So you know, you get to grips with your country, but then your issue as well. And so a lot of those podcasts and YouTube things we talked about are as good for your issue analysis here. And here I want to say you need to get your head around the issue in general, as well as trying to think about it from then later on through the filter of your country. But I think it's important to sort of think about the issue more broadly, because something I do see when I'm seeing students in model UNs is they'll get very focused on how that issue impacts their country very specifically. But the UN is always interested in debating issues and having resolutions that are applicable to multiple countries. So thinking about the broader shape and form of the issue before you put it through the filter of your country will help you to make a broader contribution to a position, even to your own position paper. You might have specific issues that are really relevant to your country, but other ones that you think are really important for progressing the issue more broadly in the UN system. And that broadens the scope of your ability to contribute to debates. It doesn't just have to be through the really narrow lens of your country. Your country might be interested in how they could progress this in ways that are going to be help more broadly or impact their neighbours or, you know, other things like that.
Mm.
So there's a set of questions in these slides, and I can share them with you, Toby, if you're interested as well, if Woodford in the group.
Oh no, these
Um,
yeah, yeah, these are great. I've been transcribing everything, but yeah, a copy of these
I
slides
can
afterwards
just,
would be superb. Because yeah,
yeah,
again, this is such a really useful resource. Because at least I've found in ones I've done, I've fallen victim to the thing where you either fall into either camp where you do way too much research on the issue and not enough on your country's position, or
yeah,
you only know your country's position and none of the other nations' positions, and you
yep,
get really caught because sometimes you tend to forget that in a model UN countries usually want to at least seem collaborative and
mm,
not as hardline as their explicit actions would suggest.
yep,
And there's all that clash can be really noticeable and can call
yeah.
you out on it. But yeah, I
And the solution needs to be applicable to a broad bunch of countries, not just to your country. So, yeah, exactly. Yeah,
mm,
fantastic.
yeah, and
So
I think
here's,
yeah. Well, it also
no,
helps like
sorry,
asking
Toby.
countries questions as well, and
Yeah,
understanding the blocks before you go in. If you know the key stakeholders and the relevance of the conflict now and who affects it and why, and then you can come in as like your nation. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So there's a set of questions for you to help structure your thinking and perhaps some research about the issue you're debating. And the sources we discussed earlier, most of them are applicable not just for your country but for issues as well. And this is where I think your academic sources start to come into their own as well to really understand the background. But there's going to be a range of them. So um, you know, thinking about the different dimensions of the issue, its extent, what qualitative and quantitative evidence there is out there around the issue, why is it in focus right now? Why is it mattering right now? Why should the UN be acting on it now? Thinking about who the key stakeholders are and their positions, what position they're likely to take, will help you to think about how you might engage with them in the room. So, you know, X is going to be interested in this angle, so I can get their engagement by incorporating that element into my resolution, right?
Mm,
Um, and you've got to have those, you know, key stakeholders on board. um, what existing actions and policies are there. So for the UN, like I've written these really broadly for any kind of policy analysis and research, but for the UN, you're specifically interested, as I mean, most of you know, earlier resolutions and actions, particularly, you know, early resolutions. And again, you can see I've written this for a broader issue, a broader audience, but are there existing UN policies and programs that address these issues? Can they be adapted to do it better? Often the tendency I see in MUNs is to want to say create a new body or a new program, and look, that's true. That's something that's happening globally as well. My area is development studies and political economy of development, and like every time you blink, the next G20 group or the next this group is creating some new fund. So there's a new loss and damage fund to try and help climate action fund, and that climate act to help fund climate action or loss and damage from climate related damage. And that comes on top of a green climate fund, of all the development banks having climate investment arms, of bilateral climate fund programs. And there's multilaterally, there's 3 big UN climate funds whose name is going to escape me, the Green Climate Fund, and there's 2 more. And they're just adding another fund on top, adding administrative costs and so on. But sometimes I've even seen it in MUNs where people are sort of creating an organisation that almost exists already. I mean, that's all right. But if you find out what's there already and say, we need to make sure UNESCO's education programs better address this issue we're looking at, because they're already doing it, that's a really nice way to be able to be strategic about your interventions. And gives you something nice to talk about too. You highlight what UNESCO is already doing in that space and how you could make it better. So there's another thing to think about. And the and then in terms of your recommendations, what are going to be the big issues about the ways forward? What are going to be the complications too? And Toby, that goes back to your point about, well, you've got your country's position that you want to progress, but you, who else is in the room? Are they going to be okay with it? Your friends and allies and enemies and so on. Enemies is a bad word, but a problematic word.
Mm.
Any comments on that bit?
Well, yeah, I think in most MUNs, there's usually already a kind of an idea of direction to where the issue should be taken, and it's more like there's been hindrances getting to it. And
Yeah,
I think just to get an understanding of your country like really quickly is to simply just look at what has the push been from the majority of the caucus, and just where has your country landed in that. And then you can kind of start to understand your nation's perspective, at least their
yeah,
diplomatic strategy, which I think is the most important thing to have down pat before you go into a MUN. Because once you have that, you can basically not like it's not preferred, but you can kind of assume the actions your nation would take, understanding how they normally act in these diplomatic situations.
excellent. Okay, so when you come to your writing, here's a nice simple structure for a position paper. And like, again, I've written these really thinking pretty broadly as well. And this is, if you're in, I mentioned at the start, if you're in a public service interview and they ask you to write a 1-page briefing paper for the minister on topic X or Y, the best way to do it is to structure it using headings, and these are kind of your standard headings to do that, but they'll also work for a position paper as well. So keep your purposes short, 1 or 2 sentences. Your background, um, um, this could be, in a longer paper, this can be a fairly extensive issue, outlining the history, probably chronologically, of the issue, the background, and why this issue's come about, who are the key players, what are the key events and factors. And, um, you know, in practice, you need to have a good understanding of the background. In writing a paper, you might not be able to put all of it into a paper, but trying to summarize that sort of very concisely. And then the issues section, and that's that dot points that I just took you through, those same questions. This is how you structure to think about the issues. So think about under your issues, you want to have dot points on what are the key elements that need to be addressed by a resolution? Which of those key elements are most relevant to your country, and for what reasons? For economics, politics, security, humanitarian, or so on. What are the options for addressing the issue in the issues section? There might be 3 or 4 alternative ways that this issue could be addressed. And so you might want to just flesh this out in a few dot points about what potential pathways there are and which one your country prefers and why. And then you come to your recommendation section. That is which one of these ways of addressing the issue. That's really it, of which one of those you're going to approach and why. And what are your implications for your country of not getting the direction you're interested in? You can also, think about your negotiation strategy, which is what Toby already mentioned, understanding who your allies and opponents in the debate were and what kind of approach you're taking about it. It can be in the position paper as well, either as a separate dot point or as just a background situation for yourself.
Mm.
That's sort of a simple structure. A more detailed policy paper is always going to have a title page, an executive summary, a one-page executive summary, and it's going to be structured around, with a table of contents, an introduction, and chapters and sections on the different issues. And often you'll have recommendations that follow out of each section in those chapters, and then they will be summarized again in the recommendation section, sometimes summarized again in the executive summaries. There's some different formats you'll see around the place for policy papers, but often you'll need to include the recommendation in each section following out of it, and then just list them as a group in your recommendation section. Conclusions are often pretty short in a policy paper, and they still need a bibliography and referencing. Any
Mm.
comments or questions there?
Nice.
I can jump on. Is a couple of other things to remember is that details matter in resolutions. Consider the standard questions of who, what, when, where, how, why, how to fund it. And language matters a lot in resolutions. Getting the wording right, and countries get very sensitive about should or could and various terms in resolutions. So there's often ways you can get your resolutions through by just being very cautious about how you word them.
Mm. Oh yeah, I found most debates in most caucuses I've been in, I've just been entirely about specific languages and the instructive, like the
Yeah,
adverbs.
yeah, exactly. The adverbs matter. Um, for recommendations, there's something called the SMART acronym. So that's the first letter of each one of these. SMART, S for specific, what policies, legislations, programs need to change in what ways and how. Measurable. And I just put a little, to a degree, proviso there, because it depends a bit what field you're working in. And I'm always a bit torn about measurements, like things like the Sustainable Development Goals for the UN. We went from the Millennium Development Goals, which were pretty vague, and they had outcomes that they knew they were going to be met by the time they set them. So they were very measurable, but they knew they were going to be met. So then they go to this, there's 167 specific targets, and they're all got to be measured by each country. And that so many of these measurements, how far you get depends on your starting point and what level of progress you were making when the achievement was set. So if you've been working on improving gender outcomes or education outcomes for the last 5 years in a country, and then the Sustainable Development Goals come in and they've got these targets, you're already just about going to be starting on that up. You are already just about starting to see that action, that those actions take hold and show up in the data. Some data takes a long time to change. And so whereas a country who hadn't been working on those topics, they're starting then 5 years behind with
Mm.
and at a zero progress rate. Getting the momentum's really slow. So, I'm just putting a proviso in there that measurable can start to become a sort of weapon against poor countries in particular, or against action, because it can create targets that you just can't meet.
Mm.
But at the same time, if you don't have measurable things, how do you know how you've gone? So,
Yeah. I've found in most caucuses, measurable parts of legislature are usually not that supported because of what you've said, but also because it's
yeah.
usually direct action that it requires, especially if it's a measurable outcome. And usually most nations don't particularly favor huge changes that are very explicit. So um yeah, I still it's very important though.
But you have got the SDGs that cover 17 different goals and 167 targets. So there's possibly one out there already on it. So
Mm.
don't forget that.
So,
Um, but yeah, I think you're right. And it's hard in a month to do measurable targets,
mm,
but measurable doesn't have to be measurable. Could be also just reporting back within 12 months or 3 years, or
mm,
um, so the next in the SMART is achievable. Is it actually things you can do? Are there trade-offs? Are they acceptable? There's always trade-offs, and are they acceptable? And who is going to be doing it? Are they really relevant to the topic you've discussed for R, and time bound? And that is actually one I've seen mums struggle with. People struggle to think about putting dates on things, and and the order of things, and that's really vital, I think, as well. But look, these are your ideal goals for recommendations. Then, in the midst of in the heat of debate, some of these are going to be forgotten. But if you can keep them in mind, it's another way, like if your country is not sort of central to a debate, that you can insert yourself into a MUN debate and say, look, this recommendation needs some time frames and some measurements. I think that's really useful, negotiating tool for a country who say, for example, in a MUN, feeling like that their country hasn't got quite as much to say on this issue. Process. There's a way to get involved.
yeah, very true. Or just
Yeah.
asking for more preambulatory clauses. So it's a fail safe. You can always do it.
Yeah. But not as fun as asking for smart recommendations.
Yes, exactly. That's real change. You're actually editing the paper instead of just adding more at the start.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, I know this kind of goes without saying, but sometimes mothers will forget. It's good to research that the change that you're implementing hasn't already happened or there's already an
Yeah,
org that does that because there are a lot of UN orgs and
exactly.
you think like, oh, this advisory committee we're setting up, this is perfect. And then you realize there's been one for like 20 years that just isn't in this committee and hasn't been brought up yet. And it's like,
Yeah.
it's really good to just make sure you've covered the full wide of bodies that have been made to address the issue you're talking about.
Yeah, excellent. Look, this is really my last slide. I just popped something in. It's just a bit, very short at the moment, but about organizing your research. So, and I think this is, things going forward into careers as well, that organizing research and documents and folders and things is really, a vital thing. And I mean, for me as an academic, but even when I was in the public service and I've worked for development in the development sector, being able to find the contract, the report on this, that on this is really vital stuff. So good systems for organizing your work, and start practicing it with your own research. But for Model UN, it's really vital. If you're allowed computers, you've got to be able to find what you needed really quickly. And one of the best ways to do that is have a Word document where you're summarizing some of your basic facts and your key link. You might put in just links to the sources if you want to go back and look at a different information, but you can organize it by by key headings. And if you use the headings function in Microsoft Word, it now lets you, a bit like to do collapsible materials. So it'll collapse the material under it and you can just see your headings. Alternatively, if you on the top of the Microsoft ribbon, under the view menu, there's something called view headings, and then it'll show you down the side of your document a list of all the subheadings in your document, and you can just click on the one you want to go to. And that's a really quick way. It's good if you're writing a longer paper as well. If you use the styles and the headings, then, you know, if I'm writing a 10,000 word journal article, I'm always using their headings, because then I can just jump between sections by clicking on one heading to the next. And subheadings, it allows you to use different levels of subheadings as well. It even lets you reorganize it too. Like if I've written something and I've put my methods before my theory section, I'm following a very traditional sort of social science structure in a paper. And then I go, oh, hold on, my methods need to come after my theory. I can actually just literally click on the heading in that view pane and move that whole section down below a section. So it's a great tool. Some of these sort of advanced word skills, if you don't know some of these things, it's just really good videos on YouTube that you can learn some of these, you know, things like how to do spacings, how to do indents automatically without having to sit there and use. So I still see students using tabs in their indents. They're like enter, tab, 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 enter, tab, tab, tab. Word will do all that stuff for you. And employers, I think these days, when I was first in the workplace, I'm so old, they just got rid of typing tools, is how old I am. And computers were just starting and everybody had to have their own. Please ignore my hand up. There's something this happens all the time on my Zoom. I don't know. I haven't touched anything. Oh, well, I've got my own.
Well,
Um,
maybe you got a question.
yeah, a question for myself. Anyway,
Could I
and
ask,
yeah, for your
if sorry,
physical folder, just to finish that same structure. Yes, sorry, Toby.
do you recommend, because this is something I've started doing in Munds, having like an opposition section in my like pre-written stuff to like nations that have opposing views to the one that I am pushing, their reason, like the context and their reasons as to why, and having pre-prepared counter arguments against them. Because I found in like recent months where I've had to be the US and someone else is Russia, and they will throw at me a bunch of very specific stuff from the Ukrainian war that I'm not that familiar with, because you
Yeah.
don't do a lot of research like Russia's side, because it's a genocide convention, but they'll bring up all this stuff and you need to be able to counter it. I found I really want to be able to counter that. So do you recommend having like an oppositional second section as a means to stop that?
Toby, I think you're the expert there rather than me. Like I'm teaching and I'm not doing them all the time as much as you are. So I think that's a great idea. Um, and yeah, I think though thinking about, I think some specific points to have, you know, would be great, but also thinking about general strategies you can use um, to deflect such tactics as well. So you've got you've got options here. You can respond to them specifically. You can deflect it onto another issue, their own behavior, and you can also deflect it onto back, changing the topic, moving it back to the actual issue of debate. So having a little set of strategies that you can use to respond to, rather than feeling the need to, in a way, react to deliberate provocations, you can have a set of strategies that are involved in responding. There's often in conflict situations, they talk about the difference between reacting and responding. And reacting is just, engaging with what they've said, but responding is about keeping it focused on the underlying issues. And so, you might, if you can't, or just can't be bothered, if you might lose everybody else in the room if you respond to every provocation from Russia. Right. So,
Well, that is actually what ended up happening. It did become like a one-on-one feud that no other country really wanted to get in on because it's very specific to us. And so yeah, you do isolate the caucus. So yeah, that's actually really good advice. Thank you.
excellent. That was really it from me. Anybody else want to add there? I see Josh is here as well, and maybe some of the team. Anybody else want to add there? I'll stop sharing my screen and maybe try and put my hand down. Don't know how I've done that. That's going to work.
Mm.
Oop. No, I'm still screen sharing.
I,
Sorry.
would you recommend also when researching your country's positions to be aware of the internal political issues within your country? Like, because for instance, like if you're the US, right, and you're campaigning for a very specific policy in like the Ukrainian war or whatnot, and because you're aware that in the US, it's a very polarizing split between the parties. One position is a lot more anti the current establishment position. Is it
Yeah,
important to I don't know, at least be aware of that fact going forward and being aware that there's a chance that your position might also be more favorable to the current administration domestically for their politics?
yeah. That's tricky because you're representing the government of the day. Um, but at the same time, if you're conscious that political change is happening, then you might, but really still you have to represent the government of the day. As a
Mm,
diplomat for your country, you don't get to go, oh, Trump will be gone soon, or oh, Biden will be gone soon. Um, you do have to represent the government of the day. I'm still trying to move. Sorry, I'm still not stopped sharing here. I do realize that.
oh,
I
it's
have
fine. It's all
three
good.
screens. There, I've got it. Um, uh,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah, so you really are representing the government of the day, I think you know, is my answer to that. It's But being aware of the political machinations, I mean, particularly if you're a big country, because for smaller countries, it's less problematic because other states are less likely to be aware of the political machinations going on at home. But if you are a state like the US, countries will be acting with a view to what they feel like are the next set of political changes going on. So, um, you
Mm.
know, you have it would be silly not to be conscious of them, but in a
Mm.
formal sense, you're representing the government of the day.
Yeah, because I found that to be a bit of a struggle representing the US, because it was a genocide caucus and there was like plenty of discussions about Palestine. And the US position, at least at the time of that MUN, was very unspecific and hadn't really taken a strong stance as to what they wanted to happen in there. They were just more or less pledging allegiance with Israel. So it was kind of hard to navigate that specifically. But oh yeah,
Mm.
that's yeah. Do you have any advice for first time winners? Like if they're starting out, what would you recommend they choose like a smaller country? Would you recommend what kind of committees they should be a part of and how they should just go about it in general?
Um, I guess for first timers, it's probably easy to represent a country whose views are not too far apart from your own views, but that can be difficult to find, right? There aren't, if you're a, you know, socially progressive person and perhaps politically also, there's a lot of conservative countries in various with conservative policies, social policies and other policies. So um, I think, but if you, for a first timer, particularly if you're uncomfortable about representing views that really clash with your own, trying to start out with someone where at least you can share some common views is probably a good size. I wouldn't say a small country or small in the sense of, I would say a country that has some political presence. So you've still got an engagement and a voice. Otherwise you could just find yourself saying it's all too hard and I don't know what my country's position will be on this. So a sort of mid-sized country that you can find out their position and understand their position on the key issues that the committee is debating would be a good place to start. But also then at the same time, if you end up with a country that does have quite different views, is just taking that as an opportunity to develop a skill that you're going to work for employers who and as whether as institutions or as individual people within them will make decisions that you will not be 100% on board with, but you can't undermine. Over the years you will definitely find yourself in those positions at work at some times. I mean, what mostly happens with people, there's an old saying, I forget who's been given who's been acknowledged with that saying, but there's a saying, it's very hard to, it's an old one, so it's a man. It's very hard to get a man to disagree with his statement that his job depends on him not on him
Ah,
agreeing with.
the paycheck. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
It's very hard to like convince someone otherwise if they're paid to think that way.
paycheck depends on it. So people often do tend to find themselves consciously or unconsciously heading towards the positions and buying into the positions of their employers, and that that often happens over a bit of time and sometimes unconsciously. Whereas when you're just representing in a country at the UN, it's going to be a bit in your face. But I think just using it, trying to see it as an opportunity to go, this is not me. This is just uni um, or practice money if you're doing it for volunteer work, fun, and this is just practice for and and I can't equally, you can't understand people's different positions until you really try and put yourselves in their shoes. So
Hmm.
really
Um,
just trying to see that play acting role of it and
do you
yeah.
have any pieces of just general advice you would give to any new mooners, like ways to speak or just like an attitude to have or maybe some note taking or something?
Yeah. Oh, I think, I mean, um, my big one is always to enjoy it, like treat it as fun and a learning experience, and then everything out of that comes from there. If you're approaching it as I'm doing this because I just want to learn and I'm gonna have some fun, and then it will go from there. It's not to really not to try and take it personally when other countries are having a bit of fun representing the position of a country that they may or may not agree with, right? So treat it as a fun and a learning experience, and yeah, that's always my starting point. What about for you, Toby, and the others on the call? Any suggestions? Key
Uh,
suggestions?
I found the way I enjoyed it the most and the way I enjoyed it, and it's probably a little sad to say, I guess, because some of the topics are pretty miserable, but treating it kind of like a drama a little bit, where
Yeah, right.
you are given a role to play and you are meant to play that role as authentically as possible. And I think when you
Yeah,
truly do everything in your best efforts to become that role, I think it can be really fun, especially once the mun is over and you have to actually learn people's names. You're not calling them Russia or I don't know, Brazil anymore. And you actually get to know these people, and the performance that people will do up there can be really engaging. I think specifically if you're starting out, I'd really recommend, and it depends the country, obviously, but trying to negotiate secretly with other nations, trying to get like amendments passed or like working on them without the collaboration of others, because it can be really fun, just the deceit involved and representing yourself one way and then presenting a bill or amendment that actually is counter to what you've been proposing the whole time can be really quite cathartic. Those are very like, I guess, visceral pleasures to doing
Yeah.
money, but I think the genuine real pleasure is understanding uh, how these mechanisms work around us
Yeah.
and how the performance of being a representative of a nation really is, and the dissonance you kind of have to have between your nation's policy and their actions, and the way language is very much used to misdirect criticism and
Yeah.
to promote your own ambitions and ideals despite what you actually believe or what you want. And
Yeah.
I think it gives you a level of critical thinking that's really you really start to see it kind of everywhere with
Yeah.
the way people will phrase certain statements and whatnot, which I
That's
really
brilliant.
enjoyed.
That's put so well. I think that that suggestion around also potentially just getting involved in some of the back room, because that can be less confronting than having to speak in front of a large group if you're feeling anxious. And that interpersonal connection that you can gain from that is wonderful. And also remembering everybody is nervous. Like, I was doing a presentation for, I had to pitch this new project I'm working on just a couple of days here at uni, and I found myself very anxious. It was maybe because it's new work, and I was very anxious again. I'm like, why am I so anxious? I've had this a few times recently, but I've always actually regarded being anxious as normal. I've always been a bit anxious. So not thinking that being anxious is normal. Everybody's lesser or more. I don't know how anxious everybody else is. I'm fairly anxious at
Yeah,
times, you know, whether you can see it or not, it's there.
yeah,
And
and
and to not let that think that that is normal, and still I don't mind my anxiety. I think it's kind of it gets me going. I'm awake when I'm anxious.
yeah.
Anxiety is my friend. I don't know. Like, there's degrees that of course I know if it can be crippling. I'm not trying to make light of it, but being friends with your anxiety is a not a bad thing.
And also remembering that just because you haven't spoken a lot doesn't mean you haven't been a huge contributor to the
Yeah.
caucus. Again, like you said, behind the scenes, negotiating and working on amendments and bills is where the most important stuff really does happen.
Yeah.
A lot of the speeches are mostly theatrics and just trying to signify your virtues to the rest of the countries there. But the most important stuff is those smaller conversations and those
Yeah.
emails and those notes you pass around. And yeah, and on the topic of anxiety, I've always found it better to like use that energy as like a propulsion to do things that I normally wouldn't feel
Yeah.
comfortable with. But yeah, it's different for everyone. But yeah,
Yeah, it's
I
different for everyone. I get that.
it does strengthen your social skills one a lot though. Like being able to talk to a lot of different people.
Yeah.
And I've always found it quite comforting because it's not me that I'm representing there. I'm like I'm Brazil, like it's
Yeah.
not you can have more fun in that anonymity that
Yeah.
comes with the performance, I guess. So
Yeah.
I found that offsets it a bit, but yeah, yeah, I really do recommend it.
Excellent. Me too. And yeah, I mean, Woodford and the team here inspire me to, keep being enthusiastic about it. So thank you all.
Yeah.
Should we wind it up there? That's going to be about close to an hour. Well, I mean, probably by the time if you cut out the first 10 minutes or
Oh,
so where we were gossiping,
no,
that'll
this
be
is
enough for people to watch.
this has been really good. I feel like the slides are really like very informative, very clear, and they give a very good structure. You've provided so many useful resources, which is one thing I think I know myself included, you really struggle with finding at the start. Like you get a country like, I don't know, like Nigeria, and you're like, oh, where do I start? Like it's not like
Yeah.
they have a huge international presence, at least not in our Western world.
No.
And yeah, all the research, the structure is really useful. And the recommendation thing too is I think one of the most important things because it's the thing that gets neglected in the
Yeah,
research beforehand because you're like, I really need to make sure I have how to represent my country properly, and then you forget, well, I actually have to pass amendments, I actually push for things, and then you that language is really important in those things, and that can really like slow down the caucus if everyone's just debating over like urges, and it should be like I don't know calls instead, you know. And yeah, I thank you so much. This has been really useful. There's a lot of people that are going to watch this and going to be they're going to have a much better time now at Gongmun. This we're on track. It's going to be a pretty decent mon. We're very excited for it, and
excellent.
we're very fortunate to have you helping us out here today.
Well, thanks, Toby. And yeah, let me know when it's on.